What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Always Hope podcast. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I pray that this episode finds you doing well today. How does the decline in marriage impact the decline in faith practice and affiliation? What has really contributed to the rise in nuns? This is a conversation that we hear often and are trying to wrap our brains around what really has contributed to the decline in faith practice. And can we really see through scientific means, not just through theological inquiry, which of course we see it there, but does the research really support that there is a connection between marriage and faith? Well, to have this important conversation, to get answers to these questions, I welcome JP De Gance, founder and president of Communio, which is a nonprofit ministry that trains and equips churches to share the gospel through the renewal of healthy relationship, marriages, and the family. In today's episode, we discuss the loneliness epidemic in America. What are the marriage and divorce statistics now in 2024? How the perception of marriage has changed from a cornerstone to a capstone venture, how the decline in marriage correlates with the decline in faith practice, how dads play a key role in their children's faith practice, and we end the episode by talking about strategies that parishes and communities can implement to better serve marriage. Well, if you enjoy this episode, I ask you please to take a second to leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. All those little gestures absolutely help get the word out about the show. Well, let's get into this conversation with JP De Gance. JP De Gance, welcome to the Always Hope podcast. How are you doing today?
Hey, really great. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome, man. Well, I know we were joking about this before, but I need to say it on air. Go Knowles. That's all I got to say. Go look, Knowles. People can't see it, but my arm has been doing this thing.
Look, I've been asked oftentimes, why I didn't go to Florida State. And as I share with everybody is that I already had a high school diploma. I didn't need a second one. So I decided to go to the University of Florida. So go Gators, baby.
Go Gators. I have to admit, going into the season and for the past 5 years, I've been like, you know what? I think I've matured. I think I've grown up. I finally have let go of my fandom for college football. It's all right, this is fine. And what I realized at the very first game against LSU, when we're scoring that touchdown to tie the game, and then we just crush them, in the second half, that it wasn't that I had matured, but rather it was 5 years of suppression that that came out irrationally. It was just it just emerged out of me. My throat was sore the next day. I mean, I was.
Yeah, it's opportunities for spiritual growth. For sure. We are in the look. Our Lord chastises those He loves, and it's been pretty clear from Florida State and Florida's recent history that that our Lord loves us very much.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, here's a segue for you. Okay, this will get into our marriage conversation. All right. People who say that monogamy is archaic or it's this long bygone era, that doesn't exist anymore, just need to look at sports fans. That's it. This is if love for a singular team that. I mean, Florida State has only won the championship twice in the last 25 years. I mean, you got the 2000 and the 2013 championship. And so there's a lot more of losing seasons than there've been winning seasons, but I have stuck with the team all these years. Why? Because I have no idea. I mean, I went to undergraduate. There's no rational explanation for it outside of just this is what it is. Love the one you're with,
man.
Yeah, you love the one you're with, exactly. And so, yeah, I'm sticking with her. That's just what it is. Yeah. And so, here it is. It's baked within us. This, and it comes out in different ways. That this need to stay committed, this need for something to kind of anchor us. And so we're going to be talking about marriage. We're going to be talking about the great work you guys are doing, the research that you've conducted. So let's just kind of start there. I mean, how bad is it? I mean, I know how bad it is, but give kind of the listeners just some understanding of what are the numbers with marriage, what are the declines, divorce rates, just kind of some high level kind of stats. Where are we as a society?
Yeah, I think a great portal here is to talk about the loneliness epidemic first, and then unpack it around marriage, right? So in May, the Surgeon General issued yet another advisory that we are experiencing this epidemic of loneliness, and if you fall into the public health definition of it, your lifespan is going to be about 15 years shorter, right? But the Surgeon General buries the lead, right? It's an 82-page advisory. The word marriage is used twice, and it's the first time is 15 pages in. The reality is, if we had marriage rates, incidences of marriage that were early 2000s, you would have no epidemic, right? There would be no loneliness crisis. Okay, the number of people getting married is down about a third since 2000. It's down nearly 2/3, but 63% since the year 1970. And so this is changing everything about who we are, right? Because who we are is formed by our family of origin, right? We learn to trust because of the first relationships we have. We can learn to we see that the man and woman who is the reason that we're here in the world, our father and our mother, love each other. They're there for each other, and I can trust that relationship. And then from there, you start to trust those relationships around you. And then if you can't trust, for instance, if so many Americans now, a majority over the last decade of Americans who've become adults, can't trust that their biological father is going to be there. Okay. And if the guy who's actually is one of the two people who are responsible for your existence, if you can't trust that that man is going to be there for you, it spills over in how you in your other relationships as well. It's changing. Certainly, it's changing faith, and the number of people getting to church is obviously on the decline. And one of the big messages I have for church leaders, for pastors, for bishops, evangelical pastors I talk to is what's changed is family structure. And that's what's causing the decline in faith practice. We can unpack that more, but that's sort of like an opening salvo to your question.
Yeah.
On a number of levels.
So marriage rates are down 62% from 1971 in the last 50 years.
1970, yes.
1970, 50 plus years. The divorce rate has kind of stabilized. It was at its lowest somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's kind of bumped up a little bit, but it hasn't really dropped. And my understanding with that is that the reason it hasn't dropped, or it's kind of stayed where it is, buoyed, is simply because the number of marriages have decreased. And so there's just less people getting married, which means that the people who are getting married, it's being skewed in the sense that these are individuals who are choosing it more than what was understood even before.
Yeah, there's some good news. One of the things any of your listeners, I would encourage you, if you've ever heard the statistic that half of all marriages end in divorce, correct the person as soon as they use it. It's incorrect.
It's incorrect.
It never was true. Shanti Feldhahn has written a great book, The Good News on Marriage, that goes into it and tries to track a sourcing of that data point. And I'm persuaded that from her research that that was what was thought to be the trend line at the late 70s, early 80s, when the divorce revolution was in full blown swing, and it never hit that level. And first time marriages, the estimates are about 35% in divorce, which means you're close to 2/3 of all first time marriages last a lifetime.
Right.
And if we understood that, that's this is important from a messaging perspective, right? Because a lot of people are terrified of lifelong commitment. And when priests and pastors and others say things like, well, it's a coin flip, half of all marriages end in divorce, that has the opposite effect of what you are intending, which is, hey, toughen up. We got to, get ready for a life of suffering or something to that effect. And one of the things I share with folks is suffering is universal to the human condition, right? You can get out of it if you're married or single. Okay. Marriage provides an opportunity, when entered into well, to have someone to suffer with, right? The question isn't whether or not you're going to escape suffering, of course, not on this side of the eschaton.
Yeah. So the divorce rates, yes, but we just said, I'm going to piggyback on that. This is going to be great. So I was recently on a panel discussion at a Family Life conference here in the Diocese of Charlotte. And in the discussion, a priest, good priest, and he made a comment similar to that. He's like, when we're pairing couples for marriage, we talk about, that marriage is hard, marriage is going to be suffering. And he said it, and I've heard this narrative before, and I responded, I said, I said, it's not so much that marriage is hard, it's that life is hard. Like
Correct.
life is hard. Life itself is hard. And what marriage gives you is somebody to journey with. And
Correct.
this is what I think what I appreciate so much about the work you're doing. And I think the angle that you're taking and with the book and the research that you have is what we need to do is we need to rethink or rebrand how we're talking about these things. And we live in a culture that has promoted, as you've already said, 50% divorce rate. Marriage is old. There's other means of happiness. There's other more effective ways of being able to live a fulfilling life. And we just stop and we look at all the research and it says, no, no, what is happening actually is that people are becoming becoming lonelier. People are becoming less happy. And then when singles are compared to their married counterparts, it's not even close. You're looking at married counterparts having higher incidences of wealth. Even the Wall Street Journal recently issued an article, and if you saw that last year or earlier this year, and they couldn't even define it. They're like, even compared to like cohabitating couples, they're like, married couples still have higher wealth. It's like, we don't really understand why. Well, man, we could go figure. Married couples have sex more frequently. Married couples are happier. Married couples are healthier, physically speaking, than their single counterparts. And it's like,
but other than that, better, right? No, I'm just kidding. Like it's not
but that's it. But besides that, it's old fashioned.
Right. There's a phenomenal book I'm incredibly excited about, hyping other books here. My friend Brad Wilcox, a professor from University of Virginia, professor there, has got a great. I've heard his talk that he's giving right now. The book will be out in Valentine's Day. Is on marriage. It's Get Married is the name of the book, and it goes into that. He just dives into the General Social Survey, which is the GSS largest, for your listeners, it's the largest regularly run, federally funded survey that's accessible. It's open source and anybody can dive into the data. So he goes into it. The happiest people in America are married people who have kids. Yeah. Okay, those are the happiest people in America. Now, I know if you're listening to this and you're married and you've got like a 3-year-old and an 18-month-old and maybe even a newborn in that cadence, you're that may sound crazy.
You're like, I don't. These guys are nuts. Right now. What are we talking about?
Me, you're on the right trend line.
Yeah. Big fan of Brad Wilcox's work, Institute Family Studies. I'm a subscriber to the newsletter. Every week they have great stuff coming in. So I want to encourage people to check that out for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. But I just want to let people know that this isn't new research. This has been very consistent. A book that I read 20 years ago called The Case for Marriage said the exact same stuff. And so the research has been consistently clear that marriages work. And even the Harvard study, which is the longest study that's ever been done on adult humans, 75-year study and still going on, researched individuals and followed them from those who were Harvard graduates to those who were growing up in the poorest part of Boston's neighborhood, and did this long-term study over them to ask questions about happiness, health, and measuring their life. And the researchers it's definitive that the number one indicator of happiness is the quality of your relationships, the quality of your period. And that's what he said in his TED Talk. That's period. Like that's the answer. And we have created a system in our society where we've kind of fragmented the goods of marriage. And we've said that we can have sex over here. We can have companionship over here. We can have friendship over here. We can even have kind of, the desire to raise somebody, pets. I'll say that I'm not a big pet. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be slamming people. This is when everybody turns off the podcast. I don't hate dogs, but I just think that this pet phenomenon that's been growing on coincides with all of this. It's like, well, we can't have kids, and so we still have this desire to want to take care of something that is needy. And so we have fragmented these different things in our society, and we've said here, 10 dimes equals $1 bill, and it's not, I know it's not 10 dimes, but still, but like we say that like we can create this, and if we could do it, then it's the same. And we're just realizing, and now where the research is abundantly clear that it's not the same thing. And, and I understand like that this isn't a call back to 1950s stereotypes. Okay, that's not what I'm advocating for. But what this looks like is moving forward is to then be able to say, well, how do we take the good of relationships and the value that is there and that we can't excuse, but then also the needed progress that has happened technologically, women being able to have careers. I mean, things that are perfectly fine and acceptable, and being able to say, how do we merge this? Like, what does this look like moving forward?
I love that you brought up this idea that sometimes people think we're advocating for a return to 1950s. We don't have a time machine DeLorean. There's nobody.
I wish.
Marriage has been around for millennia,
Mm-hmm.
and so and it will be around for millennia more. Until God calls it. Okay, so marriage isn't going anywhere in a certain sense. It is declining, right? And what we're seeing from the data is less people are living shorter lives. They're less fulfilled lives. They're more lonely, isolated, and on net less happy. Okay, and there's this great counter narrative of people who are still embracing it. And the question is whether or not folks will be informed by that data,
Mm-hmm.
or continue to rage against it. Right now, I know there's a lot of listeners who badly desire marriage,
Right?
don't feel like they can. There hasn't been. They're listening to all this. They're listening to us and saying this is great.
Yep.
JP and Mario, but I can't find somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
And our research, and when we meet, so in our ministry, we work with the local church, right? So we equip the local church to become a hub for healthy relationships and marriage ministry. And in our churches, there are 42% more women who are never married than there are men. And I tell every pastor I speak to, and this is regardless, this trend holds for Protestant and Catholic
Mm-hmm.
churches,
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, we have to own that gap, and we
Mm-hmm.
have to go out and be effective at drawing in men who into the life of the church, right? And being creative in that way to draw folks in, and we're seeing churches be effective at doing that.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I agree. I mean, people can be listening and saying, yeah, this is all great, but I'm single and I haven't been able to find somebody to date, or I am in a difficult relationship and I'm trying the best that I can, but it doesn't seem like we're making any progress. And so certainly we have wonderful episodes that attack in those questions specifically. And so I would encourage the listener, please, to follow up on some of those previous episodes. But the single piece, is important because I think, to me, it speaks to kind of the corporate nature of sin. Like, when we look at these studies, we look at these numbers, we look at these stats, I should say, there's going to be unfortunate consequences to this. And the consequence of pornography, I would say, or is that men are not having to engage, or to grow up in any substantial way, and not just pornography, but just a casual sexual place that we live in, and women also, that the things that encouraged us to be together now just don't exist. And so what's happening is that more and more people are succumbing to kind of these narratives out there that they're going to be, unfortunately, it's going to be harder. I mean, I don't want to be this depressing about that, but I mean, this is the reality of where we're at. And so, yes, you're right in terms of saying, like, well, how do we, when you talk about strategy, okay, so how do we strategize? Okay. What are the ways of being able to help parishes form those healthy relationships?
Yeah, so we talk about throughout since the time Jesus walked the earth, the gospel has been advanced through felt need ministry, right? So Jesus first healed the sick, he did those signs and wonders, and filling a felt need, and then was able to teach and proclaim the gospel. And in sub-Saharan Africa today, we do this. Catholics and other Christians are amazing missionaries in the sub-Saharan continent, and most frequently bringing first around felt need. A Catholic missionary, for instance, missionary doesn't walk off a plane and start reading from the catechism or quoting scripture. They first see a need. There's not good water here. There's not good agricultural techniques, right? And so we know that in the developed world, Mother Teresa said before her death that loneliness is the leprosy of the West, and it is worse in our poor in Calcutta. And so what we have is in many ways worse than what you see in the poverty of the undeveloped world. And I would encourage, so when we think in terms of strategy, you have to first think, where is the need? Okay, where's the need right now? And overwhelmingly, people want, even data on Gen Z and millennials, the vast majority still want marriage. They still want monogamy, and they don't know how to enter into it. And they've also imbibed some narratives that make it impossible or incredibly challenging for them to get what they say that they want, right? There's a cognitive disconnect. So with that as sort of prologue, then at the parish level, we need a metanoia. Okay, we need a transformation.
Well, before we get to the parish, let's section this off because we got plenty of time to talk here. So let's just focus in on that kind of that felt need. And I mean, if we can look at then loneliness as an epidemic, and if we can look at a lack of meaning as an epidemic, then we as a church have to be able to say, how do we? And I've been thinking about this, tremendously. It's like, how do we? I don't want to say not repurpose, but it is the challenge of every age to evangelize in the way that the culture hears it or needs to hear it. And so it's not to say that we're being crafty marketers or anything of that nature. It's just to say, well, how do we think through and say, what do we need to do to communicate a message? Because there are answers. The answer to loneliness is Jesus. The answer to happiness is Jesus. We have answers. You want, and in marriages specifically, I mean, like there are answers to these problems, and the church has solutions to them. And somehow, I just feel like that is lost. And I know that we're swimming upstream, okay? And I know something that you've talked about before in terms of cultural messages with regards to marriage specifically is this notion of a cornerstone versus a capstone. And the first time I even heard that notion was Christina Emba's work, her book, Sex, a Provocation. And I saw her talking on some dating panels. And that was the first time I'd heard anybody kind of convey that. And it's absolutely right. This notion that we have shifted this understanding of even what marriage is supposed to be, that somehow it's like this, it's the cherry on the top of life, but it's no longer this foundational thing that happens along the way. And
you're absolutely right. We did. So when we got started, so in 2015, we conducted some research with a research group called the Right Brain People. And they had done emotion-based market research. The grad is a Notre Dame grad, and the owner was a Notre Dame grad, and in behavioral psychology, and try to understand the emotional drivers of why people engage in certain decisions. And his research, he called it beyond chaos and fairy tales. Okay, and this will maybe resonate with the listeners here. Is that in so many people's lives today, there is an experience of family chaos, okay, which makes it hard and for many to have the rhyme scheme and the model from their own life of what a healthy relationship looks like and a healthy marriage looks like. And then at the same time, there is sort of this embrace of a happily ever after mentality, right? And there's a gap between what has been modeled and what is expected. Okay. And so that's what at the individual level, we have to reset expectations on. You can have marriage is not a mystery. Okay. It's not a crapshoot to figure out whether or not there's ways to actually know and discern marriage well. Yep. Okay. To know whether or not you're entering it with a person that is capable of a lifelong commitment, and whether or not you're capable of a lifelong commitment, that can be known ahead of time. And then in marriage, it's known and knowable what the skills are to grow in a healthy marriage. Both of those things are all known. And so when we know that, it gives us agency. This is incredibly important in shifting at the person-to-person level, because if I think there's this great mystery and it's a coin flip and it's a 50-50 game, and
That's
who
right.
knows? Like then I fear commitment and I fear entering into it. And the more I know we were chatting about this ahead of time. There's a book that I'm a fan of, John Van Epps, How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk. I read it to my teenagers and said, look,
And
it's too
it
late for your
should be
mom.
noted that he's your co-author also on your book. And
Yeah,
So
he is.
keep going.
And he just has an example of ways to identify some healthy bonds of attachment and how to discern it. You've created an amazing resource in Dating Well to help couples discern their relationship appropriately and effectively. So now I think it's also important for us to know that self-actualization to improve yourself is a minority behavior, right? Meaning like less people than the majority just self-actualize, like, I'm going to become better at my relationship, I'm going to be better at marriage, right? And what acts against it even more in marriage is this idea, right? So if I go on a spiritual retreat, nobody, and I come back and I say at church or to somebody, hey, Mario, I went on a spiritual retreat. Nobody's gonna say, oh, there's something wrong with JP's faith life, right? But if I come back and say, hey, I went on a marriage retreat this weekend or a marriage course last week, most people say, oh, what's going on there? Something wrong with your marriage, right? That's the enemy, right? In anything that we do, we want to get better at it. And we might already be great at something, right? And we could be, there's never a point in time we go, well, hey, look, I've maxed out my personal holiness. That's right. I don't need any more of that Ignatian stuff. I'm good. Got the, I'm ready for judgment here, or I'm ready for, I've maxed out my sanctification quotient. That's not how we approach the spiritual life. And marriage is the most common pathway, whether like it or not. And I know not everyone is called to the married life. I've got a brother who's a priest. Not everyone's called to the married life, but it's the most common path to grow in holiness. And so then the question needs to be, how am I growing in holiness through my relationship? Meaning, if I'm currently married, how am I growing in holiness? But if I feel like I'm called to the married life and I'm not yet married, then how am I growing to equip myself to be ready for marriage, right? And that's part of our growth in holiness, right? In the preparation, in what the church calls the remote preparation for the sacrament.
Yeah. So what I hear you talking about is again, speaking to these kind of dominant narratives that are operating within our cultural understanding of marriage, and this cornerstone versus capstone kind of mentality, or that the success is just a coin flip. It's a 50-50 chance for you to work one way, for it to work one way or the other, or that it's this great mystery that, it's hard and we don't really know what will make it work. I think the other piece that's driving also the challenge, culturally speaking, and what I see even more so with younger folks is this challenge of knowing how to make good decisions. And I would say, and I don't say that I don't mean to be pejorative by that, and I hope nobody takes it that way. But what I mean by this is that, and I talk about this in Dating Well, is that young people are really oversaturated with content. And we know that when we're oversaturated with content and oversaturated with options, that we don't make good decisions. The consumer science supports this. It's the paradox of choice. If you walk into the grocery store, and the studies have done this, you walk into the grocery store and they have 30 types of jam, you're going to take longer to decide what type of jam you want. Yes. And then the one that you end up deciding is you're not going to be as satisfied with it. You go into another grocery store and you only got 7 types of jam. You're going to grab the one jam. You're going to be happier with it and more satisfied and quicker in your decision making. So we're oversaturated with content. We're oversaturated with options. And this is when we're talking about just kind of where people are, what cultural waters we're swimming in. This is one of them. The other one is not just a consumerism mentality, but even consumerism itself has changed drastically over the last 10 years. When was the last time you actually purchased a CD?
Right. Sure.
Who buys?
For sure. Yeah, it's a very long time.
Very long time. When was the last time you actually bought like a DVD or Blu-ray?
Right. It's like
Never.
yeah. I can't even 20 years. I don't know. Oh
Exactly.
wow.
I actually do know the last album that I purchased. It was Coldplay, Milo Xyloto. That was the last album I actually like physically
Yeah, yeah,
purchased.
yeah, yeah.
So it's been a while.
Blink 182 something. I don't know.
The point is, it's been a few years. What
Yeah.
we have moved towards, even in consumerism, has been subscription models.
Yeah.
So why buy the one CD when I can
yeah,
model?
I
It's
love what your point is
yeah.
here. Yeah, the consumerism has, in fact, I would read when John Paul II spoke about consumerism, my Americanism would cause me to think, the Pope he's really great, probably, maybe not super accurate on this consumerism thing.
Yeah, we're capitalists. Come on.
As I've seen this kind of, as I've matured, and I feel like God's given me some more wisdom here to appreciate what the Holy Father was talking about there. We now see it in our relationships. We take consumerism, it's the swipe white mentality, right? And so having the infinite options through dating apps, folks are paralyzed in how they approach relationship. My friend Dr. Mark Regnerus talks about this in various books, and when he speaks, he talks about himself. He says, when I was dating, I was thrilled that my future wife was interested in me, and if I got into a simple spat with her when we were dating, if there was this idea there were infinite options on some website somewhere and I could just swipe away, I probably wouldn't have gotten married, right? That folks, and so we have to be aware. I've got great friends who've met their spouses through dating apps.
Absolutely.
And it for sure happens. I'm saying in general, and on average, on net, it fuels a consumer mentality. I think our parishes, right? So folks, parents ask me, young adults ask me, okay, so I'm interested. I hear everything that you're saying, JP. I want to get married. There's nobody, like, what do I do? One of the things, if it's young women, my advice is always to place yourself into social settings where you're in places where you can meet good men, and that there's a gender ratio balance, right? Or even where young ladies are, if you're in that age group and you're a young adult woman, find opportunities to hang out where you might be in the minority. So, for instance, young adult sports,
right? That's a great idea.
Church is organizing softball or kickball or ultimate frisbee. Okay, those tend to be places where, especially if a church or a ministry is organizing it, you're probably going to have men more inclined toward faith, and there's probably going to be less women engaged, right? So place yourself into the social settings, right? There's a book I cite in Endgame called Datanomics, written by, it's not from a faith perspective, it's just talking about dating and marital trends, and he comments with a lot of research supporting it that when women are in the majority, they tend to not be treated as well. Okay, and the relationship is too frequently entered into on the terms set by the guy, which is quicker movement to sex as a consequence. And then on the reverse, okay, when men are in the majority and women are in the minority, in Datanomics, he talks about that the relationship is more frequently entered into on the terms set by the woman. Now, the challenge right now is that we have in college campuses, as an example, 60-40 ratios where there's 60% women on campus, which is a massive, right? Like, you think about 20 points, that is 50% more women on campus than men, and that drives a hookup culture and a disposal, a consumerist approach relationships that heavily favors the worst instincts of men. And so from thinking through this, and obviously I have a 15-year-old daughter,
Right.
ways that we think about what she does, like schools that she's looking at. This is something that's an important factor in placing yourself into the kinds of situations that where there's a higher likelihood of a good relationship being entered into.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. Mario Casa. We're just taking a quick break here from my conversation with JP De Gance. I want to encourage you to check us out at faithandmarriage.org. If you are listening to this episode and really feeling, man, this would be a wonderful thing to do to get more involved. How can I better support my own personal marriage? Well, the best thing we can encourage you to do is to come on one of our marriage retreats. If you head on over to faithandmarriage.org, you'll see a full list of retreats that we have available for you this year. Again, you will see that a number of them are sponsored by parishes, but don't worry about that. Put yourself on the waiting list. The vast majority of those retreats do not get filled up by the respective parish, and we'll be able to hopefully accommodate everybody who wants to come on the retreat weekend. Can't make promises, but we try our best to be able to accommodate everybody. We do all of our retreats in Covington, Louisiana. We have a wonderful retreat center and a wonderful relationship with St. Joseph Abbey, where they just have a tremendous attention to detail, and the food is excellent because it is Southern Louisiana, and that's how we know how to do things down there. And so please check us out. Go to faithandmarriage.org if you and your husband or you and your spouse want to join us for an upcoming marriage retreat. We would love to have you. Let's get back to this conversation with JP De Gance. That trend right there, obviously, the 60-40 is only increasing. I mean,
Right.
Michael Gurry and Richard Reeves, I mean, I've been speaking a lot about this in terms of just what we're seeing in the education system and why men and boys are falling behind. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah. The K-12 model is heavily skewed, right? Boys and Leonard Sachs writes a lot about how boys and girls are different, men and women are different. I know that's really controversial to say, but it was common sense up until about 38 seconds ago. And, so that the process for instance, Leonard Sachs talks about there being 3,000 genetically linked sex differences between boys and girls. And even the male eye cell is different than the female eye cell. And for instance, guys' eyes make it easier to track motion and are more attracted to motion. And he notes that a female eye cell is more attracted to bright colors and round shapes, and this leads to, in his estimation, differences in playing habits of children when they're little. And I've got 4 boys and 4 girls, and my boys, when they draw, they're more likely to draw monochromally, and probably some action shot with people being blown up or something of that nature.
Right.
And the girls are more likely, my daughters are more likely to draw landscape pictures with a lot of flowers and bright colors. And so when you show up at school and you're taught ideologically through your teaching college that none of those differences really exist, and a boy draws some action image that maybe there's violence there, and so then you're taught as a young boy to that hey, maybe you shouldn't draw like that. You should draw like have you seen what Jennifer's doing over here? Look at that. And so I think our K-12 system is strongly signaling and has strongly signaled over the last 40 to 50 years, increasingly so, that education isn't really for boys, and they get the message clearly, such that the boys' performance is really low. It's bad for women. It's bad for boys. It's bad for both as a consequence, and it's certainly wreaking havoc on family structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're talking just briefly, and we can spend more time certainly talking about that specifically in the gender divide and what's happening educationally in men and women and dating scenes on campus. But a question I do have for you is, how does this all relate to decline in faith? And I know this is what a focus is of your book and a focus of the ministry and even the research that you have done. Map that out for us. How is it that this decline in marriage rates and marriage stability, marriage happiness impacts or directly correlates to the decline in faith that we're seeing?
Yeah, 8 out of 10 people sitting in church on Sunday, regardless of whether it's a Protestant church or a Catholic church, 8 out of 10 grew up in a home where mom and dad stayed continuously married. Okay. And what popped out in the data that we shared with a number of social scientists that we consulted on the research was that trend held regardless of age. Okay. And so if you're a 23-year-old, a 28-year-old, or a 59-year-old, your basic family structure is overwhelmingly likely to be from a two-parent married home. And anybody listening knows that if you're under the age of, say, 34 right now, a majority of your peers grew up in a home without continuously married parents. Okay, and so what changed first, and this is not debatable, right? Chronologically, what changed first was family structure. Mm-hmm. Okay. Non-marital birth started to skyrocket in the 60s at the advent of the sexual revolution. The divorce rate started to ascend considerably. The number of adults reaching maturity from a home where mom and dad were present began to decline. And in about 25 to 30 years after that, okay, you see the explosive growth in religious non-affiliation. And so I'd encourage any of your listeners, you can download our study for free, communio.org/study. Okay. And you can download it, share it with a pastor, any church leaders that you know. But what we conclude is that religious non-affiliation is going to keep growing. It's going to keep growing at unabated, unless, of course, I note that the Holy Spirit can do whatever he wants, right?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Change the course of history. But unless and until the growth in non-resident fatherhood stops, right? Until we see a reversal in that and married dads return to homes more normatively, you won't see a renewal. Okay, there won't be a new springtime. It'll just be a slogan for the church. And now I think it's incredibly appropriate that the Pope, for instance, who coined the phrase "the new springtime," was also the Pope of marriage and the family, right? And he gave the world his theology of the body. I don't think those two things are an accident. I think it's greatly providential. And if you think about it, what all the research that we're finding is reconfirming what we've known since the beginning of revealed history, right? The first book of the Bible begins with a marriage in the garden, and it ends in the book of Revelation with the eschatological marriage of the Lamb. You see in the most commonly used biblical metaphor for God's love for his people is a spousal love. Okay, we see it in Psalms, the Songs of Solomon. You see it in Isaiah. The amazing story of the prophet Hosea, okay, who God wanted Israel to know how the great pain of infidelity that Israel was committing in its infidelity to God, that he had Hosea marry a harlot, and he experienced the pain of that infidelity, and it was a living image of that, right? So, and then you see in Paul's writings, right, in Ephesians, right, in Ephesians 5, and you see the living icon of the bride's love for the bridegroom and the bridegroom's love for the bride is the human analog that God uses to communicate his deep love for us, right? And so when we find in the research that if you don't have a married father in the home, right, what we know is that you're less likely to have experienced the love of a father in your life. And then the divine love story is so much harder to grasp, right? That, Mario, there's a Father in heaven who loves you and loves you so much that he sent his only begotten Son to die for you so that you may have eternal life. and you say, I don't, I don't even like my dad. Okay, I can't even, this idea. Now, this is one of the big things I share with folks is this operates at such a deep level psychologically, okay, in our lives, right? That nobody, when you ask an opinion, you run a poll, right? There's a new poll saying this is why people don't go to church anymore. And you give people a multiple choice question, they'll pick something, okay? And overwhelmingly, people don't really grasp why they stopped going. And it's extremely, and there's a lot of research I cite in the study that supports that it's very unlikely for an adult to say, I'm glad you asked why I'm not going to church anymore. It was my failure to attach to my father.
No one's going to say that.
Nobody's going to say that. They're not conscious.
No one's self-aware enough to know that that's the answer.
Yeah. And so this is why it's so important, right? That for the people of God, for the church to be a champion of marriage and healthy relationships. And I'll say we've got a beautiful theology of singleness in Catholicism, and the idea of consecrated virginity and the dedicated single. There's a great book by Luann Zerlo, Single for a Greater Purpose, which goes into this is this calling of singleness that she writes about, and I love her book and her approach, and you get an understanding of what it is and what it isn't, right? And a big clue is if you think you say that you're called to the single life, but you're continuing to date, then you're not called to the single life, right? Like that's not actually
right.
That's not a vocation, okay?
Right.
But as a church, we need to equip our young people and our not so young people for marriage and relationships.
Okay. So just briefly, I'll respond just to the last comment. I appreciate you keep bringing up single people, and obviously it's important for us to recognize that there are, even as we uphold an image or uphold a value set, there's going to be margins, and there's going to be people who fall through the cracks in that. And that's okay. And the church responds by ministering to everybody, those who fall within kind of the bell curve and those who are the outside of the norms on that. And the church has ministries and support, and the Holy Spirit is there to provide care and love for everybody. And so we're grateful to acknowledge that is reality. And at the same time, it doesn't mean though that we don't still uphold a value set or don't still uphold an ideals in terms of what we're trying to obtain. It can be both. We can say we are pro-marriage and pro-single. We are pro-marriage in the sense that this is the value that we're upholding, but we recognize that because of often unforeseen circumstances in people's lives, not everybody's going to be able to get to the point where by the time they're 25 or 30, that they have found Mr. Right and they're married and they're happy, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, even for those individuals, the church is still there for you. And we're not in any way saying that the church isn't there for you. Sociologically speaking, as we back it up and we look at the data, and the stats, we say, okay, we could say that this is still the preferred option while still trying to minister and acknowledge that people aren't all going to fit into that. Both of those can coexist. I don't see any inherent conflict that is there. Unfortunately, in our society, we've tried to obliterate, and we've said anybody who doesn't fit into this, what we've said now is honestly that this ideal is just wrong, period. And it was wrong to be propped up as long as it has been. And so we've inverted the whole system, kind of culturally speaking. So to the point that you're making, why is that the case? Why have we seen a rise in nuns? Well, I mean, if we look to, and I think you're right to say that was a question that I had for myself, is like, well, what came first? It's if the two are correlated, which one comes first, the decline in the family or the decline in the faith? And what you said pretty clearly is that if you look at the data, the first blow was towards the family. And then from there, you can start seeing that it becomes this negative spiral downwards that's playing on each other, because now when you have less faith involvement, well, you have less value for marriage, which then means that you have less faith involvement, which means, and you go back and forth. And so what we're finding is that people are yeah, they don't have the awareness to be able to say, well, it's because my parents separated. That's why I'm not going to church. Where it could have been my grandparents separated. Now we're talking a couple of generations removed. And so my mom, didn't. So this is just what I was raised with. And I just don't, I don't know any better. I've never
Right.
been taught or told anything.
Yeah. And I think this is important. Additionally, we note in the study, again, I definitely encourage listeners to download it, communio.org/study, and share with folks that read it and discuss it. But one of the big things is that the reason marriage is so powerfully connected to faith practice, okay, is there's a great body of research that shows faith transmission is most likely connected to a relationship with dad, okay? And we cite this Oxford University Press study. It's a longitudinal study over 40 years, tracks 350 families, over 3,000 people. And it's trying to understand, when does faith get successfully transmitted from adult to child, okay? And this big piece of data pops out in that study. And if an adult reported having a warm or close relationship with dad, he or she had a 25% increase in having the same faith as mom and dad. Okay. If they reported instead having a warm and close relationship with mom and not vice versa, there was no likelihood of that person no increased likelihood of that person holding the same faith as mom and dad. And so what we know is currently 81%, and then 10 years ago was 87% of all children in a home with unmarried parents were with the mom. Okay. A non-married dad is, statistically speaking, not physically there. And we cite separately Dr. Paul Amato's research, who's one of the best. He's probably the Academy's best expert on fatherhood. And he's published a study called Patterns of Non-Resident Fatherhood. And he's really trying to understand the different shapes that non-resident dads take. And 68% of them are pretty infrequently engaged in the life of their children. But then he looks at the top 32% of them, the best performing cohort of non-resident dads. Okay. And what he finds in his own findings is that within 2 years, the best group of non-resident dads on average are unable to maintain anything beyond one contact every 8 to 9 days within 2 years of separation. Okay. Why that's so important is if we're interested in discipleship, okay, if we're interested in discipleship, it's hard to disciple someone that you're not physically there with. You don't have you're not there. A youth minister can't do it once a week in 30 minutes or to 3 hours. They can't do it. And a dad who's only interacting with his child once every 8 to 9 days isn't able to do it either. And then this leads us to married dads. Okay, just because you're raised in a married home doesn't mean that you're going to be able to transmit the faith will be successfully transmitted. Okay, so we talk about the analogy used from the Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, right? And certainly marriages frequently, a married home is where the good seed is thrown on good soil most frequently, and it grows. And anybody who's been in farming knows that, which isn't super common now, but you would know that seeds don't always grow, even in good soil. So the prophet Samuel spoke to God directly, okay, and his son was an awful human being, right? And so it's vitally important, but not necessary. And so that's also important why it's a big reason why we talk about dads need a married dad that keeps you in the game. But then how do you cultivate what appears in the research is this balance of a warm and close relationship with your dad, and that dad having enforcing sound discipline and rules that are not overly coercive. And that's what the secular research talks about. And I can't help but laugh. And when I think about that, about how amazing God is, right? Because God has revealed himself as just such a father. to us, right? He wants to be warm and close and have a relationship with us. And he sets out rules, and he allows us to break those rules.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's not overly coercive. And he wants us to respond to him. And so what we see is when dads, and I'm a bad imitation of the real thing, right? As dads, I'm
sure you're doing
an imitation
fine.
of the Heavenly Father. But when even as bad as I am, I'm able to image that in the best capacity that God has given me to do that. That creates that special environment where discipleship and formation and catechesis, all of that can live effectively. And our church, very rarely do churches, our pastors or Christian leaders aware of how important that relationship is. Okay. And dad, I'll tell you, sometimes this leads people into focusing just on fatherhood. And I cannot help but push back against that. Right. Okay. My vocation is not primarily fatherhood. My vocation primarily is as a husband, and my ability to be an effective dad.
It's a wedding ring.
Actually dependent.
It's a wedding ring.
Right.
It's called a wedding ring. It's called a wedding ring, not a father ring. I mean,
and so that's right. So if I can be the type of sacrificial husband that God has called me to be, so I lay down my life each day for my bride, as we see in Ephesians 5, and if I'm doing that well, then I'm going to be much better. That's the best. I tell young men, if you want to be a great dad, go and love the mother of your children.
Amen.
Right? That's the best pathway to. If you're concerned about your children, then that's your primary responsibility.
Yeah. Amen. This is awesome. All right. With the time that we have left, if we can, just briefly talk a little bit about. You're going to get there earlier, and I interrupted you, but to get into kind of some strategies. Okay, so let's say people listening are parish ministers, or have priests who listens to the show, or folks who are in youth ministry, and they're saying, wow, okay, this is all fantastic. How do we make this actionable? And I know that that's one of the gifts of what Communio does, is that it works with parishes and churches to help them create those action points and to say, okay, here's all the stuff we're talking about: loneliness, the relationship between marriage and faith, fatherlessness. Okay, wonderful. All that research is great, guys. How do we translate that into some action steps?
Yeah, look, we're not a think tank. We're a do tank, and we want to work with. We take a John the Baptist approach, right? Which is we want to decrease, we want the church to increase, and so we think that the church is the great hope for the world, because she is the body of Christ and the bride of Christ, right? And so with that said, we want to see a metanoia through the church, where it becomes normative to grow in holiness through relationship ministry. Okay, so anybody listening, you can contact us. Certainly, I'll be able to do a lot more of a deep dive, and our team can, to talk about how we serve. We're serving 160 churches in 18 different states, 19 different dioceses right now around the country. But in short, we call it, the form is the data-informed full circle relationship ministry. It's an approach, a strategic approach at the local parish level. We say data-informed to understand what's going on and to do targeted outreach. Full circle is the idea of applying ministry best practices for every stage of relationship life, from the most remote stages of preparation for marriage, and for all those who aren't going to be called, or aren't going to be able to enter into marriage for a variety of reasons, right? And then those who are engaged, married, and those who are in crisis, right? And we have we talk about, right, the hardest thing you can do is get an adult to go to a class on anything we talk about, right? Self-actualization is really hard. So we need to disrupt that strategically. And we do that through what we call the ministry engagement ladder, which is a gradual 4-step approach that we equip the parish to do, to invite people in through outreach and first fun types of activities, where about 10% of it is substantive, then into ongoing engagement, where about 30% is substantive and you're really being fed. But you're drawing people in around date nights, Oktoberfest, salsa night, fun things where you insert really good relationship skills, content, get the human formation that's so badly needed. And ultimately, then you want them to then move into and form the kinds of small groups and large group activities where you can deliver what we call the growth journey. That might be something like dating well, something like the RAM series, something for singles that helps them discern relationships well, for married people. Okay, and so we curate those resources for the local parish, and so that's ultimately it is. Most of our parishes operate. If you think about like a learning management system, most parishes have one or two tracks. It's the mass track, and then maybe the confession track, and maybe there's a CCD or an RCIA track. So it's really around the sacramental system, but our folks have not been effectively evangelized, right? And so what we do is when we work with a parish is create the kinds of low on ramps where folks from the surrounding community come in. They're not going to be attracted to an amazing discussion of the typological significance of marriage seen through scripture. I would love it. You would love it. But that's not where a lot of folks are. And so we're drawing them in. Parish nearby, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton here in Northern Virginia, we supported them in their fall festival and infusing it with good relationship ministry concepts, helped them get about 1,000 people out. A third of them were from outside the parish, new to the parish.
Awesome.
Help them think through hospitality, drawing those folks in, and they've got a plan of action to draw those folks into more the ministry around felt needs. So anyone can learn more about our process. It's a holistic approach, and we work with a parish for about 3 years in applying what we call our tools, strategies, and resources around that model I explained. And it looks different in different communities. We work with poor little churches in the plains of Montana, where they're near Indian reservations. We've worked with migrant farm parishes where there's great poverty. Okay, we've worked at large suburban churches. My brother's parish, where he's a pastor in Vero Beach, is probably I say my brother's the best client we have. I kind of have to say that, but actually it just so happens to be true. By the numbers, they're just doing an amazing job out there in championing marriage and drawing people in from the community. Their Sunday attendance in the last 2 years is up from about 1,400 people to about 2,100 people.
Incredible.
On average weekly attendance, because he's certainly preaching the gospel and standing up for the truths of the faith, and then doing so with the right on ramps, drawing people in from the community, and helping to meet felt needs, and drawing them in ultimately to an encounter with Jesus Christ.
And that's what it's all about. How do you balance things that are specifically targeted for marriages, like marriage date nights? At the parish that we're at, we've started a marriage ministry, and that's where we're starting. We're starting with marriage date nights, and I've said similar. It's like, listen, we can't start with the theology of the body conference. Like, we're going to start with fun. Food's going to be great. The night's going to look good. We're going to have a great time. And we're going to have a great talk also. And that talk will be the little bit, that 10% you talked about. It's going to get people kind of something to kind of keep coming back for. And how do you balance it? But some of the stuff you're talking about also, just kind of even looking at the fall festival or the Oktoberfest or whatever those things are, and saying, all right, like, these things are happening within the parish, but they're not a marriage specific event.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So usually, we in the ministry engagement ladder, we talk about, so we use, the first steps, invitation. So when we provide for a church, for a parish 3 times a year, we do micro-targeted outreach. We're a marketing nonprofit. We market on behalf of the local church, drawing people in. But that first step is frequently a heterogeneous group, intentionally, where it includes dating couples, singles, marrieds. Yeah. Okay. We had a church do a phenomenal outreach that was called Craft and Draft Night. And it was, I talk about there's not enough men in church. So we always coach churches on what will get a guy to show up. Okay. Parishes are inverted nightclubs, like it or not. Okay. There's more women there than men. The nightclub owner has the reverse situation. There's a lot of guys there. How do we get the ladies there? There will never be men's night at a nightclub in Tallahassee. There'll never be men drink free. That's not going to happen, right? And I'm not suggesting that parishes should get a velvet rope out, but I am suggesting a parish needs to think in terms of what creatively will draw in men, right? And so craft draft night was a fun night around the NFL draft, craft beer, craft soda, the NFL draft. They got a lot of couples and singles out, okay? And then we work with them to think through the types of activities. There'll be activities for singles and activities for couples at the same type of event. And then as you move up the ladder, you can bifurcate into activities, sometimes for couples, and then activities. I generally we find that outside of the growth journey, frequently churches should actively find ways to get heterogeneous groups of singles and couples, because singles, you don't want to attract people qua single frequently. You actually get more singles to show up when it's not, you don't put a giant neon sign saying singles.
Right, singles.
Oh, yeah. Okay. At least at the local parish level. But you want to create and craft the event in such a way that you can feed them substantively alongside couples as well. And so there's times for date nights, and then there's times for other types of community. We call ourselves Communio because it literally, of course, in Latin is community. Folks, that's what we hunger for first, and then through there, we can share the charisma. We can form people on the human level, and we know this. Any priest listening know that in seminaries today, most Catholic seminaries in the U.S. now have a perpetuitic year, where they take a year and they form men on a human level before they move them into theology, the 2 years of philosophy, 4 years of theology, right? And that's actually what we need. This kind of ministry approach is to actually form people on a human level, right? Because we know there's a lack of sound catechesis. We know there's a lack of sound knowledge on how to enter relationships. But first we got to learn to be human well, right? And then doing so in a Christ-centered community, and then you form the kinds of relationships that give you the right to then more form them after.
The idea of the church being a social hub has been lost. That's one of the things that has been greatly lost in the last.
Bring back
years.
The fish fry, 100%.
That's what I'm saying. And so but what's happened is that, like, the fish fry doesn't connect with the catechetical piece anymore, or the catechetical, Bible study, which is wonderful, doesn't connect with the fish fry. And so what's been lost has been, everything's been kind of isolated, and there hasn't been, as you're speaking about, a strategy that says, if we can look at everything that we're doing, we can see that there's overlap, and there's ways of being able to guide people on a journey that says, hey, we can have fun and we can talk about the Bible too. We could do both. Like, we can let this be a place, the church can be a place where social engagement happens on a regular basis. And in that social engagement also, we can be moving towards getting you plugged into a small group, getting you plugged into a Bible study, getting you plugged into those things that are going to educate and help you grow in your faith. And
that's
so
been the way, Mario,
forever.
Too.
I mean, that's
Don Bosco.
Yes, exactly. Yes, this isn't a new model. This is the model that's existed. Exactly. Right. It's just that we've relegated it, and we've said, well, it just, no one's going to come anyways, and so social time is just going to happen outside of the church. And that's because, again, society has changed, and it's not like where there was a church in the middle of the town that was the first thing that was built. All the communities are built around it, and so everything literally revolved around the church. We don't live in that neighborhood anymore. We don't live in that city anymore. We don't live in that structure anymore. But we can still say, even if geographically that isn't the case, we can still reclaim the reality that the church is supposed to be. A parish is supposed to be the taking care of the needs of everybody within a geographic region. That's That's the model that the church has adopted. It says, we're going to put little centers in each of these little geographic locations, and we're going to make sure that that center is responsible for taking care of everybody that's there.
Yeah, priests, whether they like it or not, are responsible. If you're a pastor, right, as a Catholic pastor, you're morally responsible for all the souls in your parish boundary. That's what canon law says, right? And I feel like great pastors both know it and embrace it and try to be creative in that. It's not just those who show up on Sunday.
Yep.
And our methodology is to give a pathway to draw in the rest of that parish boundary into the parish to do that more effectively and more strategically, right? So couldn't agree more with you.
Well, this has been wonderful. Well, JP, we could talk for another hour for sure, and maybe I'll get you back on the show at some other time to discuss further. But thank you for all the great work you've been doing. And so if people are interested in the study or in learning more about the work that you're doing, or the book itself, how can people get a hold of you?
I think the best thing for anybody listening would be to get our download our study. Then we'll be able to stay in touch with you. Communio.org/study. It's free to download. One of the things I would additional data point I would tease out in the study is if you're in your 30s, okay, and you're married, that's the peak age group of a gap in marital satisfaction between men and women, right? Mm-hmm. A married woman in church on Sunday who's in her 30s is 109% more likely to be struggling in her marriage than her husband. Okay, we need to know those things. There's a lot more data than that's in there. You can download it, communio.org/study. You can certainly get in touch with us through questions@communio.org. You email us at questions@communio.org, and then I'll get you in touch with somebody from our church engagement team and see how we can serve and support your parish.
That's wonderful. Well, we'll have links to all of that in the show notes for sure. And JP, final question to ask all my first-time guests: what gives you hope?
Well, God has hardwired us for love, okay, because it's an icon of the Trinity, right? And no matter how deformed our culture becomes in its pushing away from authentic human love, you can only move away so far before that hard wiring that God has put in us pulls us back. So I tell people I'm very optimistic about the long-term future of our country and our world. It may get bumpy between here and there, but we're wired for this. And I think the church can equip her people to be missionaries of authentic human love.
Yeah. And I think that's the piece. It's not going to just happen. The pendulum is just going to swing back on its own. We have to re-engage with the culture and re-engage with people and not just silo ourselves off and say we're done. Like we have to re-engage in the way that says people are wired for this. People are longing for this. As we said at the beginning of this episode, there are answers to these questions, but sometimes we just even have to present the questions themselves because people aren't even aware of what they're longing for anymore. And so we have work to do. We have absolute work to do. And that felt need that you said, we lead with that. We can provide solutions. The church has answers. If we can do that, then I love the optimistic stance that you've taken, which is say it's already baked within us. If we can just kind of move in that direction, then we're going to be just fine. So,
that's right.
Well, thanks, JP, for joining me on the podcast. It's been a great gift having you. Many blessings to you and the great work that you're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Mario. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Well, that does it for my conversation with JP De Gance. I encourage you to please support his ministry. Look at the work he's doing. Look at the research. You will see that there is some clear answers that we have. And as he said in the episode, and I think this is really important, what we really need is kind of a marital rebranding. That we need to encourage people to see that this is not a crapshoot, that there are strategies that we know that do help, that if it is done right, it actually is what is good for us. And that we can see, as he stated earlier, that the divorce rates for first-time marriages aren't as high as commonly, experienced or as commonly perceived. So just want to encourage everybody, check out Communio, give some support to JP's work. And love, guys. Look, I love serving you guys through this podcast. And thank you for all your time and for your attention. And we're going to have great episodes coming for you. So stay tuned. God bless you all and have a great day.